Ukraine's drone commander just said something that should terrify the Kremlin more than any single strike could. Robert Brovdy, call sign Magyar, the man running Ukraine's entire unmanned systems forces, told the BBC in a recent interview that Russian territory up to 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers deep is no longer a safe rear. Not a frontline buffer zone, not a border region. 2,000 kilometers, deep enough to swallow Moscow, swallow the Urals, and reach well into territory Russian planners spent the entire war assuming was untouchable. And this week, that claim got backed up with fresh fire. On the night of August 6th into the 7th, Ukrainian unmanned systems struck the FSB base codenamed Benya House in Kherson region, 2 additional Russian bases, a warehouse, and a training ground in occupied Crimea, along with 6 more vessels belonging to Russia's Shadow Fleet, the tanker network Moscow uses to keep oil money flowing around Western sanctions. Special Operations Forces, working alongside Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, hit the FSB facility directly in the settlement of Shashlivtsve, a place Russian intelligence officers presumably chose specifically because nobody expected a drone to find it there. 6 vessels in a single night sounds significant on its own. It's actually a rounding error compared to the campaign it belongs to. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces reported striking 159 Shadow Fleet vessels across a 12-day drone campaign in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, a number that includes a single night in July when USF Commander Brovdy announced 15 vessels hit at once, bringing an 8-day total to 105 ships struck. The enemy must understand, an SBU source told reporters after one of these strikes went further than usual, reaching a tanker off Libya's coast more than 2,000 kilometers from Ukrainian territory, that Ukraine will not stop and will beat him anywhere in the world, wherever he is. Anywhere in the world isn't hyperbole anymore. It's becoming a literal description of Ukraine's operational reach. Brovdy's own numbers, the ones his force has published and that Reuters has flagged, it couldn't independently verify, but has reported nonetheless, credit the unmanned systems forces with killing more than 50,900 Russian troops and striking over 176,500 targets in just the first 5 months of 2026. Total Russian losses across the entire war now sit near 1,345,240, according to Ukraine's General Staff. Ukraine's own defense minister has stated the strategic goal outright: up to 50,000 Russian losses per month, sustained, as a matter of policy rather than aspiration. That kind of ambition is why Brovdy has been pushing something he calls the Standard 10 inside his own ranks. In an interview with Ukrainska Pravda, he laid out the math bluntly. The current average across Ukraine's defense forces sits at roughly 3 confirmed enemy hits per strike crew per month. His own USF crews, running the same equipment, are already averaging 15.2. That means something isn't working, or something is working the wrong way, Brovdy said. There is no sector of the front where you can't destroy 10 occupiers in a month. The goal isn't more drones. It's making every crew already in the field 5 times more lethal with what they've already got. Why does any of this matter beyond the raw kill counts? Because Brovdy has been explicit about the strategic logic driving where Ukraine actually points these drones, and it comes back to exactly the safe rear comment that opened this whole story. Russia's single greatest advantage for most of this war has been depth, the simple fact that most of the country sits so far from Ukraine's border that meaningful retaliation felt almost theoretical. Brovdy's claim that 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers of that depth no longer counts as safe isn't a boast. It's a direct challenge to the strategic assumption Russian military planning has rested on since February 2022. A Le Monde profile published in late July captured how Brovdy himself frames the weapon reshaping this entire equation. He called drones the Black Death of the third millennium, a description drawn from what has become thousands of daily sorties against soldiers, vehicles, supply routes, and energy facilities alike. Brovdy is 50 years old, a former grain trader with no formal military background before 2022, who joined Ukraine's territorial defense forces on February 7th of that year and began experimenting with reconnaissance drones within weeks. President Zelensky named him a hero of Ukraine, then appointed him commander of the entire Unmanned Systems Forces branch less than a month later, betting an entire military branch on someone who'd spent the previous decade trading grain, not tanks. Russia has not taken any of this lightly. A Russian court sentenced Brovdy in absentia to life in prison in March 2026, convicting him of organizing a terrorist attack that killed a Russian state television correspondent. Russian authorities have separately charged him with 46 counts of crimes, including what prosecutors describe as terrorist attacks resulting in civilian deaths and significant property damage. Hungary, meanwhile, banned him from entering the country entirely, a decision tied to Ukrainian strikes on the Druzhba pipeline and the resulting suspension of Russian oil supplies into Hungarian territory. Brovdy's public response to Hungary's foreign minister was blunt enough that most outlets only paraphrase it. He told him exactly where he could put the sanctions. None of that seems to have slowed anything down. If anything, the pace has accelerated. Ukraine's expanding drone force now makes up enough of the country's total military capability that Kyiv wants to grow the unmanned systems forces to 5% of the entire armed forces, an enormous commitment for a single weapons category in a conventional war. The logic behind that bet is straightforward, even if the execution isn't. Drones let Ukraine trade comparatively cheap machines for the artillery, armor, and manpower it can't easily replace, offsetting a battlefield disadvantage that shaped nearly every year of this war so far. Russia isn't standing still either. Electronic warfare units, dedicated counter-drone formations like Russia's Rubicon program, and new armor protection schemes are all part of an active arms race playing out in real time, strike method against countermeasure, countermeasure against the next generation of strike method. But there's a second front to this campaign that matters just as much as the body count. And it's the one Ukraine seems to be leaning into hardest right now: money. Euromaidan Press has reported an 1,150% increase in Ukrainian deep strikes since the start of 2026 alone, and United 24 Media put a dollar figure on the damage as of mid-July. 697 targets hit across Russia, costing the Kremlin an estimated $6.1 billion. That's not a number pulled from wartime propaganda math. It's the kind of figure independent outlets have started treating as a working baseline, and it keeps climbing every month the campaign continues. Oil refineries sit at the center of that dollar figure, and the range keeps expanding in ways that should worry Russian planners specifically. On July 25th, Ukrainian drones struck the Tyumen refinery, roughly 2,000 kilometers from the front line. Days before that, a strike hit the Omsk refinery at an even greater distance, around 2,500 kilometers out, at the time the longest-range strike Ukraine had carried out in the entire war. President Zelensky has since said Ukrainian drones are already capable of reaching targets 3,000 kilometers or more from Ukrainian territory, putting the Urals, Siberia, and huge stretches of Russian territory far beyond Moscow within theoretical striking distance for the first time. He's also said Ukraine is actively extending that range further still, targeting 4,000 kilometers by the end of 2026, with drones capable of covering 5,000 to 10,000 kilometers potentially arriving in 2027. That expanding range is forcing a scramble inside Russia's own air defense network, and it's a scramble Brovdy and Zelensky both seem to be tracking closely. The majority of Russia's air defense systems remain concentrated around Moscow, government residences, the Kerch Bridge connecting occupied Crimea to Russia, and St. Petersburg, the handful of locations Russian planners have always treated as non-negotiable to protect. There are already reports of Russia relocating air defense systems from the Arctic, specifically to reinforce those priority sites, a redeployment that implies something uncomfortable for everywhere else on the map. If the defenses are moving toward Moscow and St. Petersburg, they're moving away from somewhere, and that somewhere just got a lot more exposed than it was 6 months ago. That's precisely the dynamic behind Ukraine's newest priority target list, finalized on July 26th after Zelensky met with the country's top military leadership, including newly appointed Commander-in-Chief Mikhailo Drapati, who took over the role less than a week earlier on July 22nd. The growing range of Ukraine's drones made this new list possible, Zelensky said, alongside the repeated failure of Russian air defenses to stop strikes on oil refineries, military bases, and airfields. He didn't disclose what's actually on it. Telling Russia which targets are next just hands the Kremlin time to stack air defenses around them. So for now, the list stays classified until the drones are already airborne and the fires have started. Zelensky has been explicit about what all of this is actually meant to accomplish, and it isn't purely military. Our accuracy is effectively working to create the conditions for real diplomacy, he said, framing the entire deep strike campaign as pressure aimed squarely at forcing Putin toward the negotiating table. Whether that pressure is working is genuinely contested. Sources close to Putin told the Financial Times he's unlikely to engage in serious peace talks before at least February 2027, with one source describing Russia's negotiating position as leaving essentially no room for meaningful concessions. The Kremlin dismissed reports of a potential U.S.-Ukraine air truce plan as mere speculation days after Zelensky's priority list went public, hardly the response of a government eager to stop the strikes it's currently absorbing. Whether Brovdy's 2,000-kilometer claim holds up as Russia adapts, or whether it turns out to be a high watermark from a summer when Ukrainian drone range briefly outran Russian defenses, is genuinely still an open question. What isn't in question is the FSB base that burned in Kherson region this week, the 6 Shadow Fleet vessels that went dark in the same 24 hours, and the fact that a former grain trader now has Moscow rewriting its assumptions about what counts as safe. If you want to see exactly how Ukraine turned its Shadow Fleet campaign into one of the most damaging economic weapons of this entire war, there's a full breakdown already up on the channel, and it's worth watching right alongside this one.